The night the valley started burning its own homes to stay alive, one house did nothing at all. No frantic chopping, no doors ripped from hinges, no furniture fed into flames that were already losing. And somehow, impossibly, it stayed warm. On February 9th, 1947, the cold did not arrive like a storm. It settled. Slow, heavy, certain the way a stone sinks into a river. No splash, no sound, just weight pressing down until the bottom gives. By nightfall, the thermometer nailed to a fence post outside town read 31 degrees below zero, and the wind did not howl, it pressed. Long flat sheets of air slid down from the Bighorn Mountains and pushed against every wall, every window, every weak seam a man had ever trusted with his family's life. Inside most homes in Hardin, Montana, the fire was already losing. Wood stoves glowed red, flames licked hard at iron walls. Men fed them constantly, arms aching, backs bent from a winter that had been grinding down on them since November. And still the cold found its way in. It slipped through window frames packed with cloth. It crept up from beneath floorboards laid too thin. It breathed through walls that were never meant to face something this patient, this relentless, this indifferent to everything a man could do. By 10 o'clock that night, 3 families on the same road had already begun tearing their homes apart to keep them standing. Martha Pruitt did not start with the furniture. She started with the crate of old newspapers she kept beside the stove for kindling. And when that was gone in 20 minutes, she stood in her kitchen and looked at the room, the way a woman looks at a lifeboat taking water. Her husband Walt had left 9 days earlier for ranch work near Miles City, 70 miles east, with a promise to be back before the worst of it hit. The worst of it had hit, and Walt was not here. Their son David was 4 years old. He sat on the floor wrapped in 2 wool blankets pressed against the belly of their dog, a big useless mutt named Captain, who had never been good for anything except warmth, and who was now in the cruelest hour Martha had ever known, doing the only job that mattered. The boy's breath turned white in the air. The fire beside them cracked and fought, but it was losing ground with every passing minute, and Martha could feel the house giving up around her. Not all at once, not with any drama, just a slow, quiet surrender. Heat leaving through the north wall faster than the stove could replace it, cold pooling on the floor, like water rising an inch every hour. She fed the spare chair into the fire first. Then the door frame to the back room, the one Walt had built, crooked their first summer, and never fixed. She did not hesitate because out here, hesitation was not caution. It was a down payment on a funeral. By 11, she had burned through everything in the kitchen that would catch, and the temperature inside the house had still dropped below freezing. She could see frost forming on the inside of the window glass, delicate patterns that in any other moment might have been beautiful. David had stopped shivering, which was worse than shivering. She pulled him tighter against the dog and pressed her body over both of them, making a shell of herself, a wall of blood and bone and wool against something that did not care about any of those things. Before midnight, Martha wrapped David in every blanket she owned, picked him up and walked 30 yards through 31 below zero to Harlan Briggs's door. She knocked with one hand, the other arm clamped around her son so tight her muscles burned. Briggs opened the door in his long underwear face, red eyes swollen from smoke. His own stove was roaring so hard the pipe glowed, and still his house felt no warmer than hers. He looked at Martha. He looked at the boy. And then Harlan Briggs, who had known Martha since she was a girl, who had eaten Sunday dinner at her table, who had helped Walt dig the fence posts along their shared property line, said the only honest thing he could. His voice broke around the edges when he told her that his place was losing too, that he had maybe an hour of wood left, that he could not take her in without killing all of them faster. He closed the door. Not hard, not cruel, just closed. Martha stood outside in 31 below zero holding her 4-year-old son, and understood something that no woman should ever have to understand in front of her own neighbor's door. Tonight, no one was going to save anyone. You survived alone, or you did not survive at all. She walked back to her house. She put David down next to Captain. She looked at the bookshelf, pine 3 shelves, the only piece of furniture Walt had bought new instead of built, and she pulled it away from the wall and broke it apart with her hands, board by board, and fed it into the fire. The flames jumped. The heat pushed back. And for maybe an hour, maybe two, the cold paused. Three other homes on that same road began tearing pieces from their own walls before midnight. Not out of panic, out of understanding. Fire meant survival, and survival meant sacrifice, and sacrifice meant that come morning, you would be alive in a house that was no longer whole. That was the arithmetic of cold, and every family on that stretch of frozen Montana land was doing the math in the dark. But half a mile outside of town, down a road that bent south along a frozen creek bed and disappeared into the low hills where the wind broke differently, something did not make sense. There was a house that was not fighting. No smoke rushing sideways from a desperate chimney. No lantern moving back and forth through the frost-covered windows. No sound of an axe at midnight. No children crying. No dogs howling at the cold. Just a low curved shape rising quietly from the earth, catching the moonlight, like it belonged there, like the land had grown it, the way it grew sage and stone and the long brown grass that bent but never broke under the weight of winter. Inside that house, the temperature held steady, not warm by any standard of comfort, but warm enough to live, warm enough to sit at a table without a coat, warm enough on the worst night in a generation to sleep. If you have ever felt a winter that cuts through bone, that turns your breath to ice before it leaves your mouth, that makes you understand in your marrow why ancient people worshipped fire, you already know how impossible that sounds. The house belonged to a woman named June Harlow, and 2 years earlier nobody in Hardin believed she knew what she was doing. June had come back from the war with very little. A small piece of land her father had left her. He had died of a stroke the previous spring, while she was stationed 1,500 miles away. And no one had told her until the letter caught up with her 3 weeks later. A few $100s in an envelope she kept in her coat pocket, counted so many times the bills had gone soft, and a mind that did not look at materials the way other people did. Where most saw a wall, she saw a weakness. Where most saw a roof, she saw exposure. Where most saw a house standing solid against the sky, she saw 100 ways the sky would eventually win. She had spent the war years at Fort McCoy, Wisconsin, a sprawling army installation cut into the frozen lake country of the upper Midwest, where winters arrived in October and did not leave until April forgot them. June was not a soldier. She was a nurse, an army nurse, and she had spent 2 years tending to men who had been broken in places she would never see in North Africa, in Italy, in the Pacific, men who came back to American soil with pieces missing and who were sent to Fort McCoy to heal in a place that was in its own quiet way trying to break them again with cold. Fort McCoy was not something June mentioned when she came home. The memories carried no violence, not the kind people expected from war stories anyway. What she had learned there simply did not fit into the kind of conversation anyone in Hardin wanted to have. What she had learned was about walls, about heat, about the difference between a structure that fights the cold and a structure that has already lost. Hardin, Montana was not a place that trusted strange ideas. Especially not from a woman alone, without a husband, without family, without the sort of history that buys a person the benefit of the doubt. The homes here followed a pattern that had not changed in decades. Timber walls, shallow foundations, wood stoves fighting a losing battle against 5 months of winter. Everyone knew the problem. The cold came every year, and every year it won a little more cracked. A few more foundations warped a few more doors, sent a few more families to bed wearing everything they owned. The valley had been living this way so long that losing to winter had stopped feeling like losing. It just felt like life. Until June stopped trying to fight the cold and started studying it. That first winter back, she did not build anything. She lived in her father's cabin, the one he had built 20 years earlier, with timber from the Bighorn foothills. And she suffered through the cold the way everyone else did, stove burning, all-night blankets piled on the bed, water frozen in the pitcher by morning. But she was not just enduring it, she was watching it. Every evening, as the temperature dropped and the light bled out of the sky, June stood outside and paid attention to things other people ignored. The way cold settled into low ground, first pooling in the creek bed, and the shallow draws like something liquid. The way certain slopes south-facing windshielded held warmth longer than others. Snow melting there days before it melted anywhere else. The way wind did not simply blow across the valley, but curved around the hills, finding channels, accelerating through gaps and losing force behind ridges, the way a river loses force behind a boulder. She was not a scientist. She had never studied thermodynamics or engineering or any of the disciplines that would later try to explain what she was doing. She was a nurse who had watched too many men die in badly built rooms and who had promised herself she would never be that cold again. And then she did something that made people talk. She started digging holes, not to build, to measure. Every morning before sunrise, when the air was at its coldest and the ground was locked tight, June walked out with a simple glass thermometer and a garden trowel and checked the temperature of the earth at different depths, 1 foot down, 2 feet, 3. She dug narrow test holes across her property, 15 of them by the end of January. Each one a different depth, each one carefully flagged with a strip of cloth tied to a stick, so she could find them in the snow. She recorded the temperatures in a small notebook she kept in her coat pocket, the same pocket where she kept her money. And over the course of 6 weeks, the numbers told her a story that changed everything she thought she knew about winter. The air above froze hard enough to crack wood, to split fence posts, to kill a man in an hour if he stopped moving. But the earth below barely moved. At 1 foot, the temperature hovered around 30 degrees cold, but not brutal. At 3 feet, it climbed to the high 30s. And at 6 feet down in a layer of dense clay and gravel that had not seen sunlight since before the town existed, the temperature held steady near 50 degrees. Not warm, but so far above the -20 air screaming overhead that the numbers looked like a mistake. June stood in one of those test holes one morning, frost on her hair breath, sharp enough to taste metal, hands red and stiff from digging, and she understood something that most men in this valley had spent their entire lives missing. The ground was not cold. It only looked that way from the surface. 6 feet down, the earth held a quiet, steady warmth that the worst winter in Montana could not touch, could not reach, could not even find. And if a person could build a home that leaned into that hidden warmth, instead of standing above it, exposed to every gust of wind and every degree of dropping air, that person would not need to fight winter anymore. That person would outlast it. By the time the snow melted and the ground softened enough to work, June had made her decision. She was not going to build a house like everyone else. She was going to bury part of it in the earth and shape the rest so that the wind could not touch it the same way. She was going to build down instead of up, in instead of on, and she was going to trust the ground to do what the ground had been doing for 1,000,000 years before anyone thought to ask. People laughed. Of course they did. A woman alone, no husband, no builder's experience anyone could name, talking about digging a hole and living in it. They said she was building her own grave. They bet the cold would trap her. They said the metal roof she planned to use, surplus Quonset panels, the kind the army built temporary shelters from during the war, would freeze solid and drip water inside all winter. They said the earth would flood her home the moment the spring thaw came, that she would be sleeping in mud by April, that the whole thing was the kind of idea that sounded interesting for about 5 minutes and then killed you in your sleep. And maybe the harshest truth of all, some of those fears were not wrong. Water was a real problem. Condensation was a real problem. Drainage, ventilation. The structural pressure of frozen soil expanding against a wall, all real, all dangerous, all capable of turning a clever idea into a death trap if you got the details wrong. June knew that. She had not survived Fort McCoy by being optimistic. She had survived it by being specific. But she had also accepted something most people had not. There is no perfect shelter. There never has been. Every home ever built is a compromise between what the land gives and what the weather takes. And the only question that matters is which compromises you choose. The people of Hardin had chosen thin walls, shallow foundations, and endless fire. June chose weight, depth, and shape. Neither was perfect, but one of them was losing and one of them had not been tried. She picked up a shovel one cold March morning and started cutting into frozen ground and the sound it made metal on ice ringing through the still air, like a bell, was the loneliest sound in the valley. Hank Jennings heard about it first. Hank ran the only building supply store in Hardin, a long, low-clapboard building on the main road that smelled like pine resin and kerosene, and the particular brand of dust that accumulates in places where things are sold but never cleaned. Hank was 53 years old, had run the store since his father died in 1931, and knew every nail, every board, every roll of tar paper that had gone into every house within 40 miles. When June came in to buy 3 thermometers, the good ones mercury, the kind you could trust below zero, Hank leaned on the counter and asked what she needed them for. Not suspicious, just curious. The way a man who sells tools is always curious about what they are building. June told him, briefly. She explained the test holes, the temperature gradient. The basic principle that 6 feet of earth could provide steady warmth that a wood stove could not. Hank listened politely, patiently, already composing the version of this he would tell his wife over dinner. He smiled. Not mean, not mocking, just the reflexive smile of a man who had been selling building materials for 22 years and had never once heard anyone propose living underground. He wrapped her thermometers in newspaper, took her money, and wished her luck with the careful warmth people reserve for things they expect to fail. June paused at the door. She turned back and looked at Hank with an expression he would remember longer than he wanted to. Not anger, not defiance, just a steady measuring look. The kind a person gives when they are deciding whether to remember something or let it go. She chose to let it go, and the bell above the door rang as she left. And Hank stood behind his counter, feeling for reasons he could not explain, like he had been weighed. By that evening, half the town knew. Not because Hank was a gossip, he was, but so was everyone in a town that size, but because the idea itself was so strange that it traveled on its own, the way strange ideas always do in small places where nothing much changes. A woman digging holes in the ground to measure heat. A woman planning to bury a house. A woman who had come back from the war with no husband, no family, no visible skills except a steady hand, and a way of looking at the ground that made people uncomfortable. Ed Crowley heard about it on a Tuesday standing in line at the post office behind Walter Fenn, who told it like a joke. Ed did not laugh. Ed Crowley was 58 years old, the best builder in Hardin, by a margin that no one disputed. And he had constructed or repaired nearly every home in the valley over the past 3 decades. His hands were enormous, scarred, permanently bent from years of gripping hammers and pulling saws, and he carried himself with the quiet authority of a man who had spent his life solving problems with wood and stone and sweat. He knew what worked. More importantly, he knew what failed. He had seen foundations crack, roofs collapse, walls bow under snow loads that exceeded their design by factors no one had planned for. He had rebuilt homes after floods, after fires, after the kind of winters that made men question why they lived here at all. And in all those years, across all those failures, he had never once seen anyone solve the problem by digging down. You built up, you built thick, you burned hot. That was how you survived in Montana, and Ed Crowley had staked his reputation and his livelihood on that principle for 30 years. When June Harlow came to see him on a Thursday afternoon in late March, walking up the path to his workshop with her coat buttoned against the wind and a notebook in her hand, Ed already knew what she wanted. She did not waste his time with pleasantries. She told him she needed help digging a foundation 6 feet deep and 40 feet long, that she would pay fair wages, and that she wanted his expertise because he was the best in the valley. Ed appreciated the directness. He respected it even, but he did not say yes. He stood in his workshop, surrounded by the tools and the sawdust and the smell of pine that had defined his entire adult life, and he told June Harlow that he would not help her dig a grave for herself. His voice was not unkind. There was no malice in it, no contempt, just the flat certainty of a man who believed he was saving someone from a terrible mistake. He had seen the earth swallow things before. Fence posts, foundations, entire root cellars that collapsed under the weight of frozen soil, expanding in January. The ground was not a friend. It was not a partner. It was a force that took things down and kept them, and any house built into it was a house waiting to be crushed, flooded, or frozen from the inside out. June listened. She did not argue. She did not pull out her notebook and show him the temperature readings that proved the earth held steady at 50 degrees 6 feet below the surface. She did not explain the physics, the thermal mass, the principle of using the ground as a heat battery instead of fighting it with fire. She just listened. And when Ed was finished, she nodded, once thanked him for his time, and walked back down the path toward the road. Ed watched her go. He expected to feel relief, the relief of a man who had prevented a disaster. What he felt instead was something he could not name, something small and sharp lodged somewhere behind his ribs, like a splinter he could not reach. He pushed it away and went back to his workbench. He had real houses to build. June walked home that afternoon knowing two things. First, that Ed Crowley was not a fool. His objections were grounded in real experience, real failures, real knowledge of what Montana soil could do to a man's work. He was wrong, but he was not stupid, and that made his refusal harder to dismiss and harder to overcome. Second, that she was now truly alone. The best builder in the valley would not help her. No other builder would cross Ed by taking the job, and she did not have the money to hire anyone from Billings or Miles City, even if someone there would come. She posted a notice on the board outside Hank Jennings' store the next morning. Handwritten brief offering, fair daily wages for physical labor, no experience required. She pinned it to the cork with a single thumbtack and walked out without looking back. 2 weeks passed. The notice yellowed at the edges. People read it, smiled, and moved on. The story of June Harlow's underground house had become the low-grade amusement small towns generate around anyone who refuses to fit, not mean-spirited exactly, but not kind either. Just the reflexive entertainment of a place where sameness is the price of belonging. And then Tommy Sears showed up. Tommy was 16 years old, thin as a fence rail, with hands too big for his body, and a face that had not yet decided what it would look like as a man. He lived with his mother Eleanor in a rented house on the east side of town, a house so small that in winter the stove heated all of it, and in summer the sun did the same. Eleanor had been sick since autumn, not dying sick, not hospital sick, but the kind of sick that keeps a woman in bed 3 days out of 5 and makes every dollar feel like the last one. Tommy had dropped out of school in January to look for work, and no one was hiring. Not because he was lazy, he was not. Not because he was stupid, he was not that either. But because he was 16, and in Hardin, Montana, in 1946, there were grown men with families who needed those jobs more, and a boy with no skills and no father had to wait his turn. Tommy did not come to June's door because he believed in her. He came because the notice on Hank's board was the only offer of paid work he had seen in 6 weeks, and his mother needed medicine that cost more than he had. He stood on her porch on a cold April morning, too proud to knock twice, and when June opened the door and looked at him, a boy barely old enough to swing an axe with any accuracy, wearing a coat 2 sizes too big, that had probably belonged to his father. She did not ask him if he believed in what she was building. No questions about experience, references, thermal mass soil mechanics, or any of the things she had spent the winter thinking about. June looked at Tommy Sears and saw the only person in Hardin, Montana, who was desperate enough to dig a hole with a woman no one trusted. She told him the pay, told him the hours, told him to bring gloves if he had them. Tommy nodded. He did not smile. Smiling was not something he did much of lately. They started the next morning. There was one other thing that happened that spring. A thing so small that June almost did not remember it later. But that would matter more than either of them knew. It happened in Hank Jennings' store on a late afternoon in May, when the light was flat and gold through the dusty windows and the store was nearly empty. June was buying kerosene. Martha Pruitt was buying flour. They stood side by side at the counter, 2 women who knew each other by sight, but had never exchanged more than a nod, and for a moment neither spoke. Then Martha looked over her shoulder, checking that no one else was in the aisle, and turned to June with an expression that was not quite curiosity and not quite hope, but something balanced precisely between the two. Her voice came out low, almost a whisper. The voice of a woman who did not want to be heard asking what she was asking. Martha wanted to know if the house June was building, the one everyone laughed about, the one they said would flood and freeze and collapse, would it really keep warmer than a regular house? June met her eyes. She did not oversell it. She did not make promises. She told Martha the truth, which was that she did not know yet that the theory was sound, that the numbers said it should work, but that she had never lived through a Montana winter inside the thing she was building, and she would not know for certain until she did. The only honest answer was the one she gave. Winter would answer. Martha nodded quickly, the way people nod when they want to end a conversation before someone catches them having it. She picked up her flower-paid hank and walked out without looking back. But in the doorway, just for a moment, she paused. She did not turn around. She just paused, the way a person pauses when they have heard something that fits a shape they have been carrying inside them, a shape they did not know had a name. Then she was gone, and June stood alone at the counter with a tin of kerosene and the quiet understanding that somewhere in this town at least one person was listening. The ground fought them from the first day, not with violence, not with any force a person could swing back at, but with the stubborn, patient resistance of earth that had been frozen since December and saw no reason to cooperate with two people and a borrowed team of horses. The top 2 feet were still locked, crystalline dense, ringing like iron under the blade of a shovel. June and Tommy worked in silence that first week, breaking the frozen crust inch by inch, prying loose chunks of soil that came up in slabs like broken tile. The horses stood in the trace's breath, steaming, waiting for enough loose earth to drag the slip scraper through, and most of the time they waited longer than they worked. Tommy did not complain. He did not talk much at all. And when he did, it was about logistics, where to dump the next load, how deep to cut the next pass, whether the scraper blade needed sharpening. June appreciated that. She had spent enough time around men who filled silence with opinions to recognize the value of a boy who filled it with work. They developed a rhythm without discussing it. June marked the cuts. Tommy drove the horses, and between passes they both grabbed shovels and attacked the edges by hand, widening the hole one frozen bite at a time. By the end of the first week, they had moved less than a quarter of the earth June's design required, and her hands were blistered through 2 pairs of gloves. Tommy's were worse. His gloves were thinner, older, borrowed from a neighbor who wanted them back. But he wrapped his palms in strips of cotton torn from an undershirt and kept digging. His mother's medicine went unmentioned. So did the fact that June's $3 a day was the only income entering his house. He simply showed up before sunrise, took the shovel, and went down into the hole. The second week, the earth began to soften. Not all at once. The frost retreated unevenly, letting go of sandy patches first, while holding tight to the dense clay beneath, but enough that the horses could finally do real work. The scraper bit deeper. The piles of excavated soil grew along the north and west edges of the site, forming low berms that June adjusted daily, directing Tommy to dump here, not there, building the windbreak she had designed in her notebook months earlier. Every load of dirt served 2 purposes. It came out of the hole where her house would sit, and it went onto the ridge where the wind would break against it. Nothing wasted, nothing accidental. People drove past. They always drove past. The road south of town curved close enough to June's property that anyone heading toward the creek or the lower pastures could see the hole growing, could see the woman and the boy and the horses working in it, and most of them slowed down just enough to look. June never waved. She never stopped working to explain or justify or acknowledge the stairs. She operated on a principle she had learned at Fort McCoy, watching surgeons work on men whose bodies were failing. The table is the only thing that matters. Not the gallery, not their questions. The work speaks or it does not. And either way, the audience is irrelevant. The third week broke something open. Tommy had been carrying a weight that June did not see because Tommy was 16. And pride at 16 is a fragile, vicious thing that defends itself by hiding. He had not told her about the talk at school. He was no longer enrolled, but Hardin was a small town, and the boys he had grown up with still found him in the usual places outside the feed store, at the edge of the ball field along the creek, where teenagers went to smoke cigarettes stolen from their fathers. Two of them, Danny Holm, and a kid everyone called Boot, whose real name Tommy had stopped using years ago, found him on a Wednesday afternoon, still covered in dirt from the dig, and they stood over him with the easy cruelty of boys who have never been desperate enough to take a job no one else wanted. Danny did the talking. Boot just grinned. The words were not complicated. Sears works for the crazy woman. Sears is digging a grave. Sears is her little servant, and they were not original. But they landed the way simple words always land on a boy who is already carrying too much straight through. Tommy did not show up the next morning. June waited until the sun cleared the hills, then hitched the horses herself and went down into the hole alone. She did not walk to Tommy's house. She did not send a message. She simply did the work that was in front of her, the way she had done every day since she decided to build this house, and she trusted that whatever was happening with the boy would resolve itself or it would not. And either way, the hole needed to be deeper by nightfall. She moved 2 loads that day by herself, wrestling the scraper handles with arms that shook from the effort. And by evening, her back was locked so tight she could barely stand straight. She ate dinner leaning against the cabin wall, because sitting down meant she might not get up. Tommy came back on the 3rd morning. No explanation, no apology. He picked up the shovel that was leaning where he had left it, climbed down into the hole, and started digging. June did not ask where he had been. She did not offer comfort or reassurance or any of the things a mother might have said. She was not his mother. She was the woman who paid him to dig, and she respected him enough to leave his pride intact. They worked in silence that day, and the silence was different than before. Deeper, more deliberate, carrying the particular weight of 2 people who have chosen to keep showing up, even though neither one can fully explain why. In the 4th week, the shovel hit stone. The sound was unmistakable, not the dull thud of clay or the gritty scrape of gravel, but a sharp, high ring that traveled up the handle and into Tommy's wrists like a bell struck underground. He pulled the shovel back and struck again. Same sound, same ring. He dropped to his knees and swept the loose dirt away with his hands. And there it was, a shelf of bedrock, gray-white, smooth running diagonally across the southwest corner of the excavation, like a wall laid by someone who had gotten there first. Tommy looked up at June, who was standing on the east rim of the hole watching. Her face did not change. She climbed down, knelt beside the exposed stone, and ran her hand across it gently, methodically. The way she had once checked a feverish soldier's forehead without waking him, feeling for edges, for depth, for the extent of the problem. The rock ran at least 8 feet, maybe more, and it sat at a depth of about 4.5 feet, 1.5 feet above where the floor needed to be. Breaking through it would take tools they did not have time, they could not afford, and money that no longer existed in the envelope in June's coat pocket. She sat back on her heels in the dirt at the bottom of the hole and did not speak for a long time. Tommy waited. He had learned by now that June's silences were not empty. They were working silences, the kind that meant calculations were running behind her eyes, options being measured and discarded and measured again. Finally, she stood, brushed the clay from her knees, and climbed out of the hole without a word. For 4 days, June redesigned the foundation. She spent those days at the table in her father's cabin, working with a pencil and a piece of butcher paper, redrawing the layout she had carried in her notebook for months. The bedrock forced her hand. The house would shift 8 feet to the southeast, rotating slightly on its axis to avoid the stone shelf entirely, while maintaining the orientation she needed. Long wall facing south for passive solar gain, short wall to the northwest where the wind came hardest. Tommy watched her work when he came by in the morning, standing in the doorway, while she erased and redrew, muttering numbers he did not understand. He could see that this was a kind of thinking he had no training for, and he had the sense to stay quiet around it. On the fifth day, June came out of the cabin with the new plan and walked Tommy through it, pointing at the ground, gesturing at the berms, explaining the shift. Her voice was steady, but Tommy could hear the thing underneath it. Not panic, not frustration, but the particular exhaustion of a person who has solved a problem they should not have had to solve, using resources they cannot afford to spend. They started digging again that afternoon, 8 feet to the southeast of where they had been, and the work felt heavier now, not because the soil was harder, but because they were doing part of it twice. But something else happened during that final stretch of digging. Something Tommy did not expect and would never fully be able to describe to anyone who had not felt it themselves. It was a morning in late May, early enough that frost still glazed the grass, and Tommy was standing at the bottom of the completed excavation 6 feet below the surface, surrounded by walls of clay and gravel, alone in the quiet before June arrived. The air above was cold. He could see his breath when he looked up at the pale sky framed by the edges of the hole. But down here something was different. The air was not warm, he would not have called it warm, but it was not biting, not hostile. It held a kind of neutrality that felt after months of Montana winter and Montana spring, almost like kindness. He pulled off his gloves and pressed his bare palm flat against the wall of earth. Warmth. Not radiating heat, not anything dramatic, just a steady, patient warmth that came through the soil and into his skin and said without language, without argument, without any of the persuasion that words require, "I have always been here. You just never came down far enough to feel it." Tommy kept his hand there for a long time. He was still standing that way when June appeared at the rim of the hole, looking down at him, and their eyes met, and she knew. She knew he had felt it. She did not say anything. She did not need to. The boy who had started this job because his mother needed medicine had just become something else, a believer, if that word means anything, or at least a witness to the thing that had driven June to pick up a shovel in the first place. From that morning on, Tommy Sears never worked for money again. He worked because he understood. The stone arrived in June, heavy limestone hauled from the Bighorn River, in 6 wagon loads rough cut by the current itself, 4,000 pounds of slabs and irregular blocks that had to be muscled into position by hand. Tommy drove the wagon. June selected each piece, tested its weight, and placed it into the courses she had marked on the excavation floor. 18 inches thick, every gap sealed with clay and lime. Every course level because a stone placed wrong at the bottom would throw off everything above it, and June had no margin for error. She had no margin for anything. The work ate shoulders and lower backs without apology, but June built thick on purpose, the way the old WI barracks at Fort McCoy had been built, double-course brick 18 inches or more, by men who understood what she now understood, mass's memory. A heavy wall does not just block cold. It absorbs heat hour by hour, day by day, and when the fire goes out, the wall gives back what it has been given. Grudgingly, but enough. Ed Crowley came by on a Thursday afternoon in late June, driving his truck south toward a job on the Miller Ranch. He did not plan to stop. He had not planned any of the 3 previous times he had driven past June's property either. But each time the hole had been bigger, the berms taller, the shape of something deliberate becoming harder to ignore. This time, the stone walls were visible. They rose above the floor of the excavation like the ruins of something ancient, thick and rough and oddly purposeful. And Ed found himself pulling the truck onto the shoulder and cutting the engine before he had consciously decided to do so. He sat behind the wheel and watched June work. She was below grade, visible only from the chest up, lifting a stone that must have weighed 60 pounds and placing it onto the north wall with a precision that surprised him. He watched her check the level, a simple string pulled taut across the top of the course, and adjust the stones a 1/4 inch to the left. He watched her tap it into place with the heel of her hand, then pack mortar into the joint with a flat stick. She worked the way he worked. She worked the way a person works when they have been paying attention to materials for a long time and have learned that materials do not lie. Ed did not get out of the truck. He did not call out or wave. He just sat there, engine ticking as it cooled, and watched a woman build a wall in a way that he could not immediately find fault with. Then he started the truck and drove on. 2 weeks later, he came back. This time, he got out. He walked to the edge of the excavation and stood there looking down at the walls that now rose to chest height, following the courses with his eyes left to right, line by line looking for errors the way he looked for them. In his own work, except these were not his errors to find. He studied the way the courses staggered each stone overlapping the seam below, it distributing weight and eliminating the vertical fault lines that made amateur stonework crack in the first freeze. He studied the thickness 18 inches consistent, not tapering at the top the way lazy builders let happen when they got tired of lifting heavy rock. Tommy was mixing mortar in a bucket nearby, and Ed called down to him without looking away from the stonework. He wanted to know where she got the stone. Tommy answered simply, Bighorn River. Ed studied the joints a moment longer, then climbed back in his truck and drove home. And that night he sat at his kitchen table longer than usual, drinking coffee that went cold, thinking about something he did not want to be thinking about. He had spent 30 years building homes the way his father had taught him, the way this valley had always built them. If that woman's walls held through a winter, what did it say about his? He pushed the thought away. It did not stay pushed. The Quonset panels arrived on a flatbed in early July, steel ribs curved like the bones of some enormous animal glinting in the summer sun as they unloaded in June's yard. Surplus military stock, the same corrugated steel arches that the army had used to build temporary barrack storage sheds, and aircraft hangars across every base in the country during the war. Most people who had seen them knew them as cold, loud, and temporary. The kind of structure you stored equipment in, not the kind you lived in. June saw something else in those curves. She saw a shape that had no flat surface for wind to grab, no sharp edge for cold to press against, no ridge where snow could pile and add its crushing weight to an already burdened frame. She saw a form that could cooperate with air instead of fighting it. At Fort McCoy, she had watched Quonset huts fail. They failed because they sat on top of the ground, exposed on all sides, their thin steel walls conducting cold inward like a wire conducts electricity. The shape was right. The placement was wrong. A Quonset arch on open ground was an icebox, but a Quonset arch anchored into stone buried to its haunches in the earth, with 18 inches of limestone beneath it and 6 feet of steady 50-degree soil surrounding it. That was something no one had tried, because no one had thought to ask what would happen if you put the right shape in the right place. June anchored the steel ribs directly into the stone walls, not above them, but inside them, bolting the base plates into the top course of limestone so that the curve of the roof began below grade, rising out of the earth like something organic, something that had grown rather than been built. From the outside, the finished structure barely looked like a house. It looked like a low metal hill, half swallowed by the ground, catching sunlight on its curved surface in a way that made it seem to shift and breathe with the hours. From the inside, it felt like a held breath, still enclosed and startlingly quiet. It was during the roofing that June discovered Hank Jennings would not sell to her. She needed waterproofing membrane tar-based sheeting to lay between the steel panels and the earth that would be packed against them, the barrier that would keep groundwater and snowmelt from turning her home into a well. It was standard material stocked on the second shelf of Hank's store, and when June walked in to order 4 rolls of it, Hank did not meet her eyes. He wiped his hands on his apron and told her he could not fill that order. His voice carried the particular flatness of a man who has rehearsed a refusal and is delivering it before his conscience can intervene. He did not want his name attached to a project he believed would fail when it collapsed, not if when people would ask where she got her materials, and his store would be the answer. And he could not afford that kind of reputation in a town this small. June stood at the counter where she had bought her thermometer 6 months earlier and absorbed this without expression. She simply asked Hank if there was a supplier in Billings who carried the same product. He told her there was. She thanked him, walked out and drove 80 miles east the next morning in a borrowed truck with a cracked windshield and a heater that did not work. Tommy went with her. He did not ask to be paid for the day. When they were 40 miles out the hills flattening into the long brown sweep of eastern Montana, Tommy broke a silence that had lasted since Hardin. He wanted to know where she had learned all of this, the stone, the shape, the depth, the way she seemed to already know what the earth would do before she tested it. June did not answer right away. The road unspooled ahead of them, straight and empty, and the truck rattled over potholes that had been there since before the war. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter than Tommy had ever heard it, carrying the specific weight of something a person says only once and never repeats. She told him she had learned it in a place where she watched people die from cold. Not from battle, not from wounds, not from any of the things people imagined when they thought about war, from cold. From buildings that could not hold heat. From walls that gave up and floors that froze and roofs that let the wind take everything a stove could give. She told him she had learned it by watching which rooms the survivors came from and which rooms produced the dead, and understanding that the difference between those rooms was not luck or God or fate, but 12 inches of brick. Tommy did not ask another question for the remaining 40 miles. He did not need to. He had heard enough to understand that June Harlow was not building a house because she had a theory. She was building one because she had a memory. They bought the waterproofing in Billings, loaded it into the truck bed, and drove home in the late afternoon light with the Bighorn Mountains growing on the horizon ahead of them. And neither of them spoke, and the silence between them was the most complete thing either of them had ever shared. October came and June moved in. No ceremony, no announcement, no neighbors bringing bread or salt or any of the small rituals that mark the beginning of a life in a new home. Just a woman carrying boxes from her father's cabin to a low metal curve in the earth. A wood stove she had salvaged from a ranch sale in August, and a house that no one believed would survive its first winter. The first nights were cold. She expected that. The stone walls had spent 6 months absorbing the ambient temperature of the earth, a steady 50 degrees. But the interior air was another matter. It needed to be heated, and the walls needed to be taught what warmth felt like. Day after day, night after night, June fed the stove and let the heat soak into 18 inches of limestone. The process was invisible and maddeningly slow. The stove would roar, the air would warm, and within an hour of letting the fire die down, the temperature would drop again as the stone absorbed the heat and held it, giving nothing back yet, not until it had taken enough to have something to give. Outside, the opinion of Hardin continued to operate as opinion always does in small towns, as a weather system, invisible but omnipresent, shaping what people said and who they spoke to. Ed Crowley at the feed store called her structure a mistake waiting to announce itself. The metal would freeze and sweat. The walls would wick moisture and rot from the inside. The earth would reclaim the whole thing by spring. Hank Jennings nodded along. The county assessor, a man named Bill Worth, who had never built anything in his life, offered his own verdict. No rational person builds down into the cold. You build up and away from it. That had always been the rule, and June had broken it with a shovel and a borrowed team of horses. June heard all of it because a town this size has no walls that keep sound out. She had made a decision months ago, standing in a hole in the ground with dirt under her nails and a thermometer in her hand, and that decision did not require the valley's approval. You do not prove a structure with words. You prove it with winter, and winter was coming. In November, something happened that June told no one about. She fell asleep in her chair beside the stove on a night when the temperature outside dropped to 11 below. She had been reading a novel she had found in her father's things, dog-eared and water-stained. And the warmth of the stove and the stillness of the house and the cumulative exhaustion of 7 months of labor pulled her under without warning. She woke at 3 in the morning, disoriented, the book on her lap. The stove cold, not warm, not smoldering, cold. The fire had been out for hours. She sat in the dark and waited for the panic. It did not come. The air in the house was cool, cooler than she would have liked, but not cold, not freezing. Not anything close to the savage, bone-deep cold that was pressing against the outside of her walls at that moment. The stone had been absorbing heat for 6 weeks, steadily, patiently taking in everything the stove offered, and storing it the way a river stores rain, invisibly, incrementally, until the reservoir is full. And now, with the fire dead and the air outside well below zero, the stone was releasing that stored warmth back into the room, slowly, reluctantly, but enough. June sat in the dark and listened to her house hold her. The silence was not empty. It was structural, the silence of mass doing its work of weight, performing the function it was designed for, of 18 inches of limestone standing between her and a winter that had killed men better prepared than she was. She breathed in and the air was cool, but it was not hostile. She breathed out and her breath did not frost. She knew then, not hope, not theorized, not calculated, knew. The thing she had built was working. But the first winter was ordinary, cold, yes, Montana. Cold, the kind that freezes pipes and kills car batteries and keeps people indoors from November to March. But not historic. Not the kind of cold that tests a house to its limits and reveals what it is actually made of. June's home performed well. The stove burned less wood than any comparable house in the valley. The interior held steady. The walls did not sweat, the floor did not flood, the roof did not drip. Everything the doubters had predicted would fail had not failed. But it had not been tested either, and June understood the difference. A house that survives a normal winter proves nothing. Every house in Hardin survived normal winters. That was the minimum, not the standard. The people who had predicted failure shifted their language without shifting their position. They stopped saying the house would collapse and started saying they were waiting to see what a real winter would do. The subtext was clear: this is not over. And June agreed with them, though for different reasons. She was waiting too. January 1947 arrived with a kind of deceptive mildness that long-time residents recognized as a warning. Warm days, clear skies, the temperature climbing to 20 above in the afternoons and falling gently to single digits at night. Comfortable for Montana. Almost pleasant. But something about the pattern disturbed June in a way she could feel but not articulate. The sky was too clear. The wind was too absent. The barometric pressure, which she tracked on a gauge mounted beside her door, held unnaturally high day after day, as if the atmosphere were holding its breath. She had seen weather like this once before. At Fort McCoy in the third week of January 1944, the sky had gone exactly this quiet, exactly this still. And 4 days later, a polar air mass dropped out of Canada and froze the installation so completely that water mains burst underground, and 3 men in an outlying guard post lost fingers to frostbite before they could be relieved. June remembered the silence that preceded it, the way the world went flat and held as if the cold were gathering itself somewhere just beyond the horizon, building mass and density and patience before it moved. She began stacking firewood against the south wall of her house. Not frantically, not in large quantities, just enough. She trusted the house. She trusted the stone. But trust is not the same as recklessness. And the sky was telling her something that her body remembered, even if her mind could not yet name it. By the first week of February, the barometer had not moved in 6 days. The sky was white, opaque, featureless, pressing down on the valley like a lid. The wind had stopped entirely, and the silence was so complete that you could hear the creek ice cracking from half a mile away. June stood on the berm north of her house one evening and looked at that sky and felt the hair rise on her arms. Something was coming, something the valley had not seen in years, something that would arrive not with warning but with weight, not with violence but with duration. And when it came, it would not ask what anyone believed. It would ask what they had built. It came on the evening of February 8th, and it did not announce itself the way blizzards do, with wind and noise and the kind of atmospheric theater that gives a person time to prepare. It simply arrived. The temperature, which had been hovering near zero all day, cold Hardin had lived with for months, began to drop at 4 in the afternoon and did not stop. By 6 it had passed -10. By 8, -20. By midnight, the mercury sat at 31 degrees below zero, motionless, as if it had found a floor and settled onto it with no intention of rising again. The barometer, which had held unnaturally high for a week, collapsed in 3 hours. The pressure differential pulled air down from the Arctic shelf, with a force that meteorologists in Billings would later describe as anomalous, a word that means nothing to a family burning furniture at midnight. The cold was not a storm. Storms move. This sat. It occupied the valley the way an army occupies a town, not passing through, not raiding, just taking possession and holding. And the wind that accompanied it was not the howling, chaotic wind of a blizzard, but something worse, a steady horizontal pressure. Sheets of frozen air sliding off the Bighorn ridgeline with mechanical consistency, pressing against every surface they found with the patience of something that had nowhere else to be. The first homes began failing before 10 o'clock. Failing is the wrong word. They did not collapse or break. They simply could not keep up. Stoves that had burned adequately all winter were suddenly inadequate. Walls that had held through December and January were suddenly transparent to cold thermal barriers in name, only leaking heat faster than any fire could replace it. The arithmetic was merciless. A wood stove produces a finite number of BTUs per hour, and at 31 below, with a 15-mile-per-hour wind pressing against a 4-inch timber wall, the math turns against you sometime around 9 o'clock and never turns back. Families burn through their wood piles at 3 times the normal rate. Men who had stacked what they thought was a week's supply beside the back door found themselves running out before dawn. The Tomlinson family, half a mile north of the creek, went through nearly a full cord in a single night. A volume of wood that should have lasted 5 days under normal conditions gone in 12 hours. And by morning, their house was still below freezing. The Fenns, who lived closest to the wind gap where the valley narrowed toward the mountains, abandoned their home entirely at 2 in the morning and walked 300 yards to Walter Fenn's brother's house, carrying 2 children wrapped in horse blankets that smelled like sweat and hay and fear. Ed Crowley did not sleep. He sat in the front room of the house he had built with his own hands 18 years earlier, feeding the stove every 40 minutes, and felt something he had never felt in that room before: defeat. Not sudden, not dramatic. A slow-spreading recognition, like watching a crack travel across a pane of glass, that the thing he had built, the thing he had staked his name and his expertise on, the thing he had pointed to for nearly 2 decades as proof that he knew what he was doing, was not enough. The wind found the seams he had caulked in October. The cold pressed through the north wall he had framed with the best timber he could buy. The floor, which he had insulated with sawdust between the joists, radiated a chill that no amount of fire could overcome because the foundation was shallow. 18 inches of air between the floorboards and the frozen earth, and 18 inches of air at 31 below is not insulation. It is a highway. Ed sat in his chair, hands on his knees, stove roaring so hard the pipe joints glowed dull orange, and thought about a house half a mile south that he had refused to help build. He thought about limestone walls 18 inches thick. He thought about a foundation 6 feet below the surface where the temperature held at 50 degrees regardless of what the atmosphere was doing. He thought about these things, and he hated that he was thinking them, and he could not stop. At Martha Pruitt's house, the bookshelf was gone. The spare chair was gone. The door frame to the back room was gone. Everything that could burn had burned. And by 2 in the morning on the second night, there was nothing left except the bed frame, the kitchen table, and the walls themselves. David had stopped crying. He lay between Martha and Captain with his eyes open, breathing in shallow pulls, his small body conserving heat the way children's bodies do, unconsciously, efficiently, with a biological wisdom that has nothing to do with understanding and everything to do with survival. Martha held him and calculated. She calculated the wood in the bed frame against the hours until dawn. She calculated the table against the hours after that. She calculated the walls, actual walls, the structure of her home, against the day beyond. And the numbers were simple and terrible and final. She thought about June Harlow's house. She thought about the question she had asked in Hank Jennings' store 8 months ago, the question she had whispered like a secret. Would it really keep warmer? And she thought about June's answer, winter will answer. And winter was answering now. And the answer was yes. And Martha was on the wrong side of it. But half a mile south, in a house that looked like a hill and breathed like a stone, the night was different. June's stove had settled into coals sometime around 11. She had fed it once before bed, a modest load split pine, nothing extravagant, and gone to sleep under 2 wool blankets on a narrow cot pushed against the south wall. She did not wake to feed it again. She did not need to. The coals dimmed and grayed, and the iron body of the stove cooled from red to black. And the air in the room cooled with it dropping a degree, then 2, then stabilizing at a temperature that had nothing to do with fire and everything to do with the 18 inches of limestone that surrounded her on 3 sides and the 6 feet of earth that surrounded the limestone. At 58 degrees, the house held. The stone walls, which had been absorbing heat since October, 4 months of daily fires, 4 months of slow, patient thermal charging, were now performing the function they had been designed for. They were giving back. Not quickly, not generously, but steadily. The way a well gives water from a reserve that is invisible until you need it, and then it is the only thing that matters. Tommy Sears arrived before dawn on the second morning, pushing through wind that cut through his coat like the coat was not there. He had come for a pry bar. His mother's cabin door had frozen shut, the frame swollen with ice, and he needed a tool heavy enough to break it open. He expected to grab the bar from June's lean-to and leave. He did not expect what happened when he pushed open June's front door and stepped across the threshold. The cold released him. Not all at once, not like walking into a heated room. There was no blast of warm air, no sudden relief. It was subtler than that. The wind stopped. The pressure on his skin eased. The constant grinding tension in his muscles, the tension of a body clenching against cold for hours, so habitual that he had stopped noticing it, relaxed. He stood just inside the doorway and breathed, and his breath did not frost, and the air that entered his lungs did not burn, and for the first time in 2 days, his hands unclenched. June was at the kitchen table. Wool shirt, no coat, no hat. A cup of coffee in front of her, and a piece of bread with butter. Eating breakfast with the calm, unhurried manner of a woman whose morning had not been interrupted by an emergency, because for her there was no emergency. The stove behind her was dark, cold to the touch. It had not been fed since before midnight, and the coals had gone to ash hours ago. Tommy looked at the thermometer mounted on the wall beside the door. The indoor needle pointed to 57. He looked at the outdoor thermometer, visible through the small window, a tube mounted on a post outside level with the glass. It read 31 below. 88 degrees of difference held by stone and earth and shape, without fire, without fuel, without any of the desperate measures that every other household in the valley was taking at that moment to stay alive. Tommy stood in the doorway and could not speak. He looked around the room, the stone walls he had helped build, the curved steel ceiling. He had watched June anchor into place, the dry gravel floor. The quiet, and understood for the first time the full measure of what they had made. Not a house. A conviction rendered in limestone and steel that the old way of fighting winter was a war no one could win, and that the only sane response was to step out of the battle entirely and let the earth do what the earth had always done. June watched him over her coffee. She did not gloat. She did not say anything that could be mistaken for triumph. She simply existed inside the proof of her own work and let the temperature speak for itself, because the temperature was more eloquent than any words she could have assembled. Then Tommy told her about Martha. The words came out in pieces. Martha's husband still gone, the woodpile exhausted, the furniture burned. David wrapped in blankets against the dog, the house dropping below 20 degrees inside. He had passed the Pruitt place on his way here, had seen no smoke from the chimney, had thought about stopping but did not because he had nothing to offer. No wood, no heat, no solution. June set down her coffee. She looked at the stove, dead cold, unnecessary, and then at the walls that had made it unnecessary, and something moved behind her eyes that Tommy recognized from the months of digging and hauling and building. Not calculation exactly, decision. The kind of decision a person makes when the math is already done and the only thing left is the action. She told Tommy to stay and keep the stove ready in case it was needed. Then she pulled on her coat, loaded an armful of split wood onto the hand sled she kept by the door, and walked out into 31 below zero. Half a mile is not far. In summer on flat ground, a person can walk it in 8 minutes. At 31 below into wind pulling a sled, it is a different distance entirely. It is a distance measured not in yards but in exposure. In how many minutes of skin contact with that air a human body can sustain before the damage begins, before the fingers stop responding, before the face goes numb, and the lungs seize against the cold they are being asked to process. June walked it in 14 minutes, head down, scarf wrapped across her mouth, pulling the sled with both hands, and by the time she reached Martha's door, her eyelashes were frozen together, and she could not feel her ears. She knocked. Martha opened the door, and the woman June saw in that doorframe was not the same woman who had whispered a question in Hank Jennings' store. That woman had been cautious, curious, hedging her interest against the cost of being seen as foolish. This woman was beyond caution, beyond curiosity. She stood in a dark house with a silent stove and a child pressed against a dog, and she looked at June with the flat, exhausted honesty of a person who has run out of options and knows it. June told Martha to bring David, to bring the blankets, to come now. Martha did not move immediately. She looked at June and asked the only question that mattered in that moment, her voice raw, stripped of everything except the need to know, before she carried her son into 31 below. She wanted to know if June's house was actually warm, or if June was guessing, hoping, performing the same desperate optimism that everyone else was performing, while their homes died around them. June held Martha's gaze and told her she had drunk coffee that morning without a coat. Martha wrapped David in every blanket. She called Captain, and she walked out into the worst night of her life, following a woman she had never fully trusted, toward a house she had never fully believed in, because the alternative was to stay in a dead house and calculate how long the bed frame would burn. The walk back took longer. Martha carried David, who was too cold to walk, and June pulled the sled with the wood she had brought, wood Martha no longer needed, but which June loaded anyway, because waste was something she had never learned to accept. They did not speak. The wind filled every silence with its own flat, constant voice, and by the time they reached the low curve of June's roof, Martha's legs were shaking so badly she could barely stand. She stepped inside. The door closed behind her, and Martha Pruitt, who had spent 2 days burning her home to save her son, stood in a room where the air was still, where the stone walls radiated a warmth she could feel on her face, where the thermometer read 56 degrees, and the stove was cold, and the world outside was a place she no longer had to survive alone. She pressed David against her chest and cried, not from relief exactly, though relief was part of it, from the sudden, overwhelming recognition that warmth had been here all along, half a mile from her freezing house, built by a woman the town had laughed at, available to anyone who had been willing to believe. The third night brought Ed Crowley to June's door. He did not come for shelter. His own house was still standing still, heated, still consuming wood, at a rate that would leave him with nothing by the end of the week, if the cold held but standing. He came because he could not stay away any longer. The splinter that had lodged behind his ribs the day he refused to help June dig her foundation had been working its way deeper for 18 months, and now in the third night of the worst cold he had ever experienced, it reached something vital. He knocked once. June opened the door. Ed stood on the threshold with ice in his beard and his hands tucked under his arms and his eyes carrying the specific weight of a man confronting the collapse of his own expertise. No request to enter, no apology, no reference to the workshop 18 months earlier, or the words he had used, grave mistake, none of it. Just one question, and the question was not about survival or comfort or warmth. It was a builder's question, the only question a man like Ed Crowley could bring himself to ask. because it was the only question that did not require him to admit in words what his presence at her door had already admitted. He wanted to know how thick the walls were. June looked at the man who had refused her, who had dismissed her, who had told the valley she was building a mistake, and saw not an enemy but a craftsman standing at the edge of his own understanding, afraid to step further and unable to turn back. She told him 18 inches, and she told him to come inside. Ed entered. Martha sat in the corner with David, asleep in her lap and Captain at her feet. Tommy sat by the stove, lit now, burning low more for comfort than necessity. Ed walked to the north wall and placed his hand flat against the stone and held it there, palm open, fingers spread, as if the wall might have a pulse. The stone was warm, not hot, not feverish. Warm the way the earth is warm at 6 feet steady, unhurried, indifferent to the catastrophe howling outside. He stood there with his hand on the wall for a long time, feeling the heat that had taken 4 months to store and would take days to exhaust. And he understood in his palm what he had resisted in his mind for a year and a half. Everything he had built leaked. Every house, every barn, every structure he had framed and raised and handed over to families with pride, they all leaked heat faster than they could make it. And they always had, and he had never seen it because he had never been shown the alternative. He was being shown now. He pressed his palm harder against the stone as if he could absorb the lesson through his skin, and the wall gave him its warmth the way it gave June hers, patiently, without judgment, without any interest in whether the man touching it had earned the right to feel it. An hour passed before Ed said a word. He sat in a chair. Tommy brought him coats, still on running calculations he had spent his career avoiding. When he finally looked at June, his eyes were wet, and he did not try to hide it. And what he said was not an apology, because an apology would have been too small for what had happened. He simply said that he had not known. 3 words: he had not known. June poured him coffee. The stove crackled softly. Outside, the valley froze and burned and tore itself apart. Inside, 4 people and a dog sat in 54 degrees of stone-held warmth, and the fire was optional. The 4th day broke the siege. The temperature climbed not to anything comfortable, not even to 0, but up away from the floor it had occupied for 96 hours, and the valley exhaled. Men emerged from houses that looked like they had been ransacked. Door frames missing, shelves gone, walls scarred, where boards had been pried loose and fed to stoves that ate everything and gave back nothing. 3 families had abandoned their homes entirely. 2 others had sustained damage that would take months to repair. No one had died, which was the only good number to come out of those 4 days, but the margin had been thin enough to taste. June had used less than half the firewood of any comparable home in the valley. Her lowest indoor temperature across 4 days and 4 nights, including one full night with no fire at all, was 54 degrees. She had slept every night. She had eaten every meal at her table in her wool shirt without a coat. She had done nothing heroic, nothing extraordinary, nothing that required strength or endurance beyond the ordinary. She had simply lived inside a house that was designed to do exactly what it did, hold warmth when the world could not. And the house had performed with the quiet, reliable competence of something that was never fighting in the first place. Spring came late that year. The way spring always comes late after a hard winter. Reluctantly, in small increments, as if the season itself is not sure the cold is finished. But when it came, the valley was different. Not louder, not more hopeful, not any of the things stories usually claim about communities after a crisis. Just quieter. Thoughtful in a way that Hardin had not been before, because the crisis had not been the kind that brings people together. It had been the kind that sends every family into its own private battle and leaves them afterward with the knowledge that they fought alone and nearly lost. The changes came without announcement. Ed Crowley ordered limestone from the Bighorn Quarry in March. He did not tell anyone what it was for. By April, he had added a course of stone rough uncut, stacked the way June stacked hers, to the north wall of his house. He did not insulate the entire structure. He did not dig down. He did not remake his home in the image of June's. But he put stone where the wind hit hardest, and when someone asked him about it, he said nothing. And the nothing was louder than anything he had ever said about June Harlow. Hank Jennings restocked his store that spring. With waterproofing membrane, the same tar-based sheeting he had refused to sell June 10 months earlier. He placed it on the front shelf visible from the door, priced fairly available to anyone who walked in. He did not reference the refusal. He did not acknowledge the reversal. He simply stocked it the way a man stocks something he expects to sell. And the presence of that material on his shelf said everything his mouth would not. One rancher south of town deepened his foundation by 2 feet during a spring renovation. Another buried the north side of his root cellar under an additional 3 feet of earth. A third added stone to his chimney wall, doubling its thickness. No one called these changes by any name. No one credited June. No one organized a meeting or formed a committee or did any of the formal things that towns do when they have learned a lesson collectively. The lesson simply spread the way warmth spreads through stone, slowly, invisibly from the source outward, until the thing that received it can give it to the next thing and the next. Martha Pruitt brought bread to June's house every Sunday that spring. She came alone the first few times then with David, who played in the dirt berms, while the women sat inside drinking coffee in a room that smelled like stone and wood smoke, and the particular stillness of a place that has proven itself. Martha never said thank you in words. She did not need to. The bread said it. The visits said it. The fact that she came at all to a house the town had once called a grave said everything that mattered. One Sunday in late April, Martha brought Walt. He had returned from Miles City in early March, walking into a house with no bookshelf, no spare chairs. Scorch marks on the floor where the door frame used to be, and a wife who looked at him with an expression he had never seen before. Not anger, not blame, something harder to name. She had survived something he had not been present for, and the distance that created between them was not one that could be closed with an apology or a hug. It could only be closed by understanding, and understanding required seeing. Walt stood in June's house and looked at the walls, the ceiling, the stove that sat cold and unused on a 50-degree afternoon, and turned to Martha with a question that was not really a question. He wanted to know why no one had told him. Martha met his eyes and answered with 5 words that carried the weight of everything the valley had learned that winter, and everything it had refused to learn in all the winters before. She told him it was because no one believed. June never stood before the town. She never claimed discovery or demanded recognition, or assembled the kind of argument that might have forced Hardin to reckon with what she had proven. She was not interested in being right. She was interested in being warm, and she was warm, and the house she had built continued to be warm year after year, winter after winter, with a consistency that made argument unnecessary and silence sufficient. Tommy Sears turned 17 that spring. He finished the school year, Eleanor insisted, and Eleanor was recovering slowly the medicine Tommy had paid for with his wages from the dig, doing its invisible work. Tommy graduated from Hardin High School 2 years later, unremarkably without honors, without any distinction that a transcript could capture. But he built his own house at 23 on a piece of land his mother left him when she died in 1954, and the house had limestone on the north wall and a foundation 4 feet deep and a shape that let the wind pass over it without pressing. And everyone who knew Tommy knew where he had learned to build that way. He told the story for the rest of his life. Not often, not loudly, not the way men tell stories they want to be admired for having witnessed. He told it the way a man tells a story that changed the way he sees the world, carefully, precisely, with attention to the details that matter, and silence around the ones that do not. He told it to his son on a summer evening sitting on the porch of the house he had built, looking out at the hills where the Bighorn River cut through the valley, and the wind bent the grass but did not break it. His boy sat beside him, 12 years old, brown from the sun, listening with the incomplete attention of a child who does not yet know which stories will stay. Tommy did not mind. He had learned from June that you do not build for the audience. You build for the winter. And the winter always comes, and when it comes, it does not ask what you believe or who you are, or whether the world considers you qualified to do what you have done. It asks one question only, and the question is structural, and the answer is in the walls. Tommy leaned back in his chair and told his son that June Harlow did not invent anything new. She remembered something everyone else had forgotten, that the ground is always warmer than we think, if we are willing to go low enough to ask. The boy nodded, not yet understanding. The wind moved through the valley, bending the grass flat, carrying the smell of sage and dust, and the distant cold of a winter that was already forming somewhere over the mountains, gathering itself patient and certain and inevitable. The ground held its warmth. It always had. It always would. The only question was whether anyone would remember to listen.